More than 27 million Americans watched in disbelief as Chief Justice John Roberts, the most powerful judge in the country, suddenly screamed at Michelle Obama during a live congressional hearing. In just 3 explosive minutes, the Supreme Court chamber, once a symbol of dignity, erupted into a storm of rage, racial tension, and raw humiliation. With Roberts' voice thundering accusations that Michelle didn't have the intellect or the right to question him. Cameras captured every second as Roberts, his face purple with fury, lashed out at Michelle, implying that someone like her should know her place. But instead of flinching, Michelle leaned forward, locked eyes with the Chief Justice, and delivered a calm, razor-sharp response that exposed the hypocrisy at the very heart of America's highest court. She spoke about teenage girls forced to bear children after rape, challenged Roberts on his personal values as a father, and reminded the entire nation that even Supreme Court justices are public servants who must answer for decisions that destroy real lives. Michelle's ice-cold comeback shattered centuries of silence and sparked a political firestorm that's still burning today. So what exactly did Michelle Obama say that could turn the tide like that, and what truth did she expose that could scare Justice John Roberts so much? There's a certain hush that hangs over the Supreme Court, a hush so thick it feels like velvet drapes pulled across a room full of secrets. It's the hush of polished wood and the faint scent of expensive cologne worn by men who've worn the same style of suit for 30 years. You could drop a gavel in there and swear you'd hear it echo all the way to Delaware. The justices sit perched behind their massive wooden bench like a row of ancient owls, their faces solemn, their expressions giving away nothing, except maybe when Justice Adams, whose hearing isn't what it used to be, starts nodding off mid-argument. Law clerks exchange frantic glances, pretending to drop pens just to nudge him awake, and the entire courtroom pretends not to notice when a soft snore slips out over the microphone, leaving the bailiff coughing loudly to cover it up. Sometimes the clerks whisper, "Did he just nod off again?" and shuffle papers noisily to hide a laugh. Lawyers preparing to argue landmark cases rehearse every syllable, terrified of missing a word. Yet deep down, they all know that there's a 50-50 chance one of the justices is secretly sketching a doodle of a cat in the margins of a legal brief. This is the quiet, peculiar dance of the Supreme Court, ancient tradition, stern faces, and the occasional sleepy justice, whose gentle snores might be the most honest sound in the room. It's a place where power wears a robe, silence has weight, and decorum is treated like a sacred ritual. And that's exactly why nobody, and I mean nobody, was prepared for what happened next. Because that hush, so heavy it could suffocate a secret, was shattered on a morning no one would ever forget, the day a man who almost never leaves his marble fortress decided to walk into Congress himself. The first sign that something extraordinary was about to happen came not with words, but with the sudden flurry of cameras and the stuttering gasp that rolled through the hearing room like a shockwave. Journalists leaned forward in their seats so quickly you could hear chair legs scraping the floor, and aides clutched folders to their chests as if bracing for an earthquake. Into the hearing room strode Chief Justice John Roberts, America's highest judge, whose very name usually hangs over the country like a quiet, heavy cloud of authority. He entered with measured steps, wearing the same crisp black robe that's become as much a part of his identity as the silver comb lines in his perfectly parted hair. On the outside, he looked like the embodiment of calm power, chin raised, back straight, his face arranged in the polite neutrality of a man who'd spent decades learning never to flinch. But for those who looked closely, those who caught the fleeting flicker in his eyes, it was clear something inside him was vibrating like a tuning fork struck too hard. His eyes darted across the room as though he was searching for an exit, even while marching deeper into the lion's den, the way a man might walk into a battlefield he knows he can't avoid. Flashbulbs popped like tiny bursts of lightning, catching the gleam of sweat beginning to form at his hairline. Even though the air conditioning was blasting so hard, senators in the first row were discreetly rubbing goosebumps off their arms. Senators who had moments earlier been casually flipping through briefing folders were now sitting bolt upright, gripping pens like weapons, all political calculations spinning behind their eyes. The reporters jostled for position, some standing on tiptoe, eager to catch every angle of this historic and completely unexpected entrance. The room's atmosphere shifted, becoming thick and electric, as though every molecule in the air had been charged. This was not a man who came for polite formalities. This was a man bracing for a fight. And as his gaze finally settled across the witness table at the woman waiting there, Michelle Obama, a woman whose very name sparks reverence or rage in different corners of America, a silent understanding passed through the room. Something monumental was about to explode, something so raw and unprecedented that people who witnessed it would remember exactly where they were for the rest of their lives. Because this was no longer just another hearing. It was a collision course between the highest judge in the land and a black woman who'd built her life on grace, intelligence, and an unshakable refusal to be silent. And nobody, not even Roberts himself, seemed ready for the war about to unfold. And then came Michelle. 61 years old, looking like she'd just stepped out of the pages of Vogue, wrapped in a burgundy blazer sharp enough to cut glass, her hair styled in soft waves, framing a face, equal parts warmth and steel. The hush that had swallowed the room cracked open the instant she appeared, as if the air itself recognized that someone formidable had entered the battlefield. She walked with a certain calm confidence, her heels tapping the marble floor like a measured drumbeat, her posture upright, eyes scanning the senators as though she were assessing a jury she fully expected to win over. There was no trace of fear, only the quiet certainty of a woman who had faced worse storms than a courtroom full of politicians and come out standing taller every time. An intern near the back leaned forward, eyes wide, and whispered just loud enough for a few aides to hear, "Is that Michelle Obama or Olivia Pope?" Which triggered a ripple of laughter that skittered nervously around the chamber. Even a few of the senators couldn't suppress a quick grin, despite the tension crackling like static in the air. Michelle caught the murmur, gave a small wry smile, and lifted her hand in a modest, almost shy wave that instantly charmed half the room. Cameras zoomed in, catching the soft laugh lines around her eyes, the quiet dignity in the way she held herself, the aura that seemed to glow even under harsh fluorescent lights. For a moment, the entire chamber felt lighter, as if Michelle's presence alone could shift the weight of history. But that moment lasted only as long as a held breath, because no one, not the senators, not the press, not even Michelle herself, could have predicted that Chief Justice John Roberts would suddenly, completely snap. He started speaking in his usual calm, measured baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to commanding rooms and cloaking power in civility. "Congresswoman," he began, leaning slightly forward, his fingers steepled, "I urge you to show respect for the court and for the sanctity of this hearing." His words hung in the air, sharp but controlled, a gentle slap instead of a punch. Michelle tilted her head, cool and unbothered, preparing to answer with that precise, lawyerly cadence of hers. But before a single syllable could leave her lips, Roberts's composure cracked wide open. In a split second, the man who had built an entire career on judicial temperament was gone, replaced by a trembling figure whose face flushed an alarming shade of crimson. His hands slammed the table so hard the microphones rattled, and with a voice that roared across the marble chamber like a cannon blast, he screamed, "You don't have the intellect or the right." Every inch of the room froze in stunned horror. Aides went pale, senators jerked upright in their chairs as if electrified, and the press gallery gasped so loudly it was almost a collective shriek. The Chief Justice's face twisted with fury, veins bulging at his temples, spittle flying from his mouth as he leaned forward, practically snarling the words at Michelle. For a man so famously cautious, so expertly trained to speak in measured legal phrases, the outburst was like an earthquake, splitting the very floor beneath him. Cameras captured every frame in excruciating high definition. Roberts's eyes wild and glassy, his robe quivering as though it could barely contain the rage coursing through him. It was the kind of moment that sears itself into the national consciousness, a single volcanic eruption that would ripple outward through every news channel, every social media platform, every dinner table discussion across the country. And at its center was Michelle Obama, still sitting perfectly still, her lips parted slightly in surprise, as if even she could hardly believe the man before her was the same Chief Justice who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of reason, decorum, and judicial restraint. The room held its breath, caught between the echoes of his scream and the terrifying silence that followed, as everyone wondered, what in God's name would happen next? And Michelle just sat there. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't even blink in the face of a screaming Chief Justice whose voice still seemed to hang in the air like gun smoke. Instead, she sat back in her chair with the faintest tilt of her head, as if she were waiting for the Wi-Fi to reconnect after a brief, annoying glitch. The contrast was almost comical. The nation's highest judge, red-faced and trembling with rage, while Michelle, unfazed, slowly reached for the glass of water in front of her. She lifted it to her lips, took a delicate sip, set it back down, and cleared her throat so gently that it almost seemed like she might ask for the room temperature. Then she spoke, her voice soft, but perfectly pitched to reach every corner of the chamber, and said, "I'm sorry. Were you finished screaming?" The words landed like a mic drop cloaked in velvet. A few aides near the back audibly choked on their breath, and even some of the senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes darting between Michelle and Roberts, as though witnessing a car crash they couldn't look away from. On the Republican side of the committee, several members suddenly found intense fascination in their notes, scribbling invisible lines just to avoid meeting Michelle's eyes. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the chamber, nervous but undeniable, because there was something both hilarious and astonishing about watching Michelle Obama treat the Chief Justice's meltdown as if it were a toddler's tantrum in the middle of a grocery store. Cameras zoomed in on her composed face, the slight arch of her eyebrow, the flicker of dry humor in her eyes, capturing the precise moment America realized that Michelle Obama was not only unshakable, but might actually be enjoying herself a little in the face of this chaos. But laughter dissolved in an instant as Michelle leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, her expression shifting from gentle amusement to something sharper, colder, a lawyer preparing to dismantle an argument piece by piece. Her voice dropped lower, intimate yet cutting, as she asked, "Chief Justice, do you have daughters?" The question sliced through the room, so sudden and quiet that it drew the oxygen out of the air. Even the ever-clicking cameras seemed to pause for half a second, lenses freezing mid-focus as every ear strained to hear what would come next. Roberts's eyes widened a fraction, his jaw working as if to form words, but Michelle didn't give him the chance. She continued, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of 100 broken hearts, painting a picture that landed with brutal force. She spoke of a 14-year-old girl, terrified and sobbing in an examination room, who had been raped and now faced the possibility of carrying that pregnancy to term because of the Supreme Court's ruling. She described the sterile glare of fluorescent lights, the tremble in a child's voice as she whispered secrets she was too young to even understand, and the cold reality that under Roberts's decision, states could deny her the choice to end that pregnancy. Michelle's words were clinical yet devastating, each syllable carefully chosen, echoing through the chamber like a funeral toll. The room grew so silent it was as if time itself had frozen. Lawmakers sat stone still, reporters lowered their pens mid-scratch, and even the hum of air conditioning seemed to vanish under the crushing weight of what Michelle was forcing them all to confront. In that moment, the spectacle of Roberts's rage faded into insignificance compared to the stark truth Michelle laid bare, that behind lofty legal arguments were real children, real trauma, and futures permanently altered by decisions made by men in robes. The emotional gravity was inescapable, and for a few heartbeats, the entire country seemed to hold its breath, because no matter where anyone in that room stood politically, they all knew one thing. Michelle Obama had just seized control of the narrative, and there was no going back. Twitter exploded, Facebook caught fire, and TikTok did what TikTok does, stitching together rapid-fire videos of Chief Justice John Roberts mid-scream set to pop songs, comedic voiceovers, and the kind of dramatic zooms that make even the Supreme Court look like the backdrop of a reality show meltdown. Within minutes, the hashtags #, Roberts Rage, and #, Michelle Clapback were trending worldwide, with timelines flooded by endless memes. One popular image showed Roberts frozen in mid-yell, mouth open so wide it seemed he might swallow his own gavel, overlaid with the caption, "When your Wi-Fi cuts out mid-argument." Another viral post featured Michelle Obama cool as ice, slipping on a pair of oversized sunglasses with a single word beneath her photo: mood. It was as if the entire internet had been handed the script to a blockbuster drama and decided collectively to turn it into a comedy roast. Late-night hosts barely waited for the sun to set before airing jokes about the Supreme Court turning into Judge Judy's courtroom, while digital artists mocked up fake movie posters titled "Roberts the Meltdown," featuring Michelle as the unshakable heroine. For a brief, dizzying moment, it felt like America might actually laugh its way through the chaos. But underneath the memes, America was trembling. Because as funny as the internet can be, everyone knew there was nothing funny about what this confrontation revealed. In the days that followed, newscasts shifted from playing viral clips to rolling out sobering headlines announcing that public trust in the Supreme Court had plummeted to record lows. Poll after poll showed Americans losing faith in the idea that the highest court in the land could remain impartial after witnessing its Chief Justice explode in rage on live television. Protesters gathered outside courthouses holding signs that read, "No justice without accountability," and "Robes can't hide racism," their chants echoing off marble columns. Across the nation, conversations spilled into living rooms, churches, and barbershops about the terrifying implications of a man in such power revealing so much fury, and perhaps prejudice, toward a black woman who dared to question him. Meanwhile, senators who had been content to stay silent found themselves cornered by reporters demanding statements. One by one, they began speaking up, first cautiously, then more forcefully, until some were outright calling for Chief Justice Roberts to resign. Legal experts debated whether his meltdown compromised his ability to rule fairly on cases, especially those involving race, gender, or reproductive rights. Editorials filled newspapers, arguing that a man who couldn't handle pointed questions in a congressional hearing might no longer deserve to wield the weight of final legal judgment over a nation of 330 million people. In boardrooms and newsrooms alike, the question hung heavy in the air. How could the Supreme Court continue to command respect when its leader had just shown the country that he could lose control so spectacularly? And at the center of the storm stood Michelle Obama, not merely unscathed, but transformed into a symbol of calm resistance and moral clarity. Her words replayed again and again as proof that truth can silence even the loudest roar of power. Yet for all the admiration and viral praise, a new, deeper problem had emerged, one that laughter alone could never dissolve. Because this was no longer just about a single outburst or a single courtroom. It was about the fragile foundation of trust on which American justice itself depends, and about whether that foundation had just cracked wide open before the eyes of the world. The following morning, the nation held its collective breath as a sea of microphones clustered on the steps of the Capitol, cameras blinking like curious eyes, reporters jostling for space as though history might leak out any second. Into this noisy chaos stepped Michelle Obama, wearing a navy suit that somehow managed to look both regal and defiant, her hair pulled back in a sleek twist that revealed every inch of her composed expression. She took her place at the podium, waited just long enough for the noise to die down, and then tilted her head with that same wry smile the country had seen 1,000 times. "Well," she said, pausing just long enough for every microphone to lean closer. "Guess that was one heck of a Tuesday." The line dropped like a pebble into still water, sending ripples of surprised laughter through the press corps. A few journalists exhaled the tension they'd been holding in their chests since the day before, trading half smiles as camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. Michelle glanced sideways at the flashing bulbs, as though pondering how absurd it all seemed, then added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "Next time, I'll bring popcorn." That was it. The room broke into chuckles, some reporters clutching their notepads as if to steady themselves. Even a few of the stern-faced senators lingering in the background were caught grinning despite themselves. It was classic Michelle. Grace under fire, humor wielded like a scalpel, cutting through tension while reminding the country that dignity didn't mean silence, and certainly didn't mean surrender. For a few precious moments, the chaos of the previous day seemed almost like the plot of a wild political thriller rather than real life, and the entire nation collectively remembered how to breathe. But as the laughter faded, Michelle's face sobered, and the weight of what she'd come to say settled heavily over the crowd. Her voice, strong yet soft as velvet, echoed through the microphones as she declared, "I may be a black woman, I may be 61, but I am a lawyer, a mother, and an American citizen. And no one, not even the Chief Justice of the United States, is above answering for the pain their decisions cause." Her words hung in the crisp morning air, sharp as glass, slicing through any remnants of doubt or confusion left swirling around her confrontation with Roberts. The reporters shifted, eyes widening, pens flying as they scrambled to capture every syllable. Michelle went on, speaking not as a former First Lady, but as an advocate, a fighter, a woman determined to lay bare the truth so many were too afraid to say. She spoke of young girls forced into motherhood, of families shattered by decisions rendered from high marble benches, of communities that bore the heaviest burdens of laws written by men who might never meet those they affected. Her voice trembled only once, just enough for the cameras to capture a flicker of human vulnerability that made her strength shine even brighter. As her speech rolled on, the footage cut away to scenes of ordinary Americans watching her on televisions in diners, in living rooms, in break rooms and barbershops, nodding along with silent tears in their eyes. Cheering crowds gathered outside courthouses, holding signs that read, "Accountability for all" and "Thank you, Michelle." Little black girls stared wide-eyed at screens, seeing in her the proof that a black woman could stand her ground against the highest powers in the nation and emerge not merely unbroken, but triumphant. And yet, even amidst the rising swell of applause and hope, the stakes remained deadly serious, because Michelle had pulled back the curtain and forced America to look at the cost of injustice, the hidden victims behind each legal decision, and the truth that silence was no longer an option. By the end of the week, Michelle's clapback wasn't just a viral moment. It had become a cultural phenomenon blazing through every corner of American life, from sleek corporate boardrooms to backyard barbecues where folding chairs and paper plates were the backdrop for passionate debates. Across offices, a new phrase entered the vocabulary, with workers leaning across conference tables to whisper, "I'm pulling a Michelle Obama on this budget cut," before launching into impassioned arguments that left their bosses blinking in surprise. In a suburban living room, a grandmother wagged her finger at her grown son as he tried to sneak the last piece of pecan pie and declared, "Don't make me go full Michelle on you," causing the entire family to dissolve into laughter. Television sketch shows seized on the moment, airing skits where people in wildly unrelated situations, from restaurant mix-ups to family game night disputes, chanted "Michelle clapback" before delivering pointed truths that left everyone else speechless. It was as though Michelle's calm defiance had given Americans permission to challenge authority, to speak their minds, and to do it with humor sharp enough to draw blood without ever raising their voices. But as the jokes circled and the memes kept multiplying, a darker undercurrent pulsed beneath the laughter, growing louder with every news cycle. Because this hadn't been just a dramatic meltdown, it was becoming painfully clear that the Chief Justice's outburst had ignited a firestorm no one knew how to contain. International newspapers ran blistering headlines accusing America's justice system of hypocrisy, with columnists writing that a nation claiming to champion freedom had exposed its deepest fractures on live television. In Berlin, a leading legal journal published an essay bluntly titled "When Democracy Yells Back: Racism and Rage in America's Highest Court," dissecting Roberts' words as a symbol of institutional bias. Reporters in London described the spectacle as the day American justice lost its robes and revealed its true face, while broadcasters in Africa and Latin America debated whether such a display could ever happen in their own highest courts, or whether it merely proved that power is the same everywhere. At home, legal scholars debated on cable news panels late into the night, faces tense under studio lights as they questioned whether Chief Justice Roberts could ever again be trusted to rule impartially, especially on cases involving race, gender, or reproductive rights. Pundits who once defended Roberts as the institutionalist began to admit, sometimes with evident sorrow, that the court's credibility might never recover from the image of its leader screaming at a black woman who dared ask hard questions. Meanwhile, corporate clients, those powerful companies whose cases often come before the Supreme Court, began murmuring behind closed doors about whether they could risk having Roberts preside over disputes that touched on race or gender discrimination, fearing that his name itself might now spell reputational disaster. Because the truth was inescapable. This wasn't just a meltdown caught on camera. It was the start of what some were already calling a constitutional crisis. A growing chorus of voices argued that America's highest court could not remain the ultimate arbiter of justice if the man at its helm had proven himself capable of such raw fury, and, perhaps even worse, of letting deeply rooted biases slip through in the heat of an argument. The stakes were suddenly far larger than one hearing, or even one Supreme Court justice. They reached into the very question of whether Americans could still believe in the impartiality of the legal system, and whether justice could exist when power itself seemed unable to withstand being questioned. As the sun set on a week unlike any other, the nation stood divided, staring into an uncertain future, wondering what new battle lines would be drawn next, and who would have the courage to cross them. In the days that followed, as the country struggled to absorb the shockwaves of what had unfolded, a hush once again settled over the corridors of power. But this time, it felt different, as though every marble pillar in Washington was listening a little more closely. Then came a quiet interview, filmed in a softly lit studio, where Michelle Obama sat across from a seasoned journalist, whose usual brisk demeanor seemed gentled by the gravity of what had transpired. Michelle wore a simple navy dress, no flashy jewelry, her hair cascading around her shoulders in relaxed waves. She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on her knee, and spoke in the same measured, serene tone that had become her signature. "Sometimes," she said, pausing just long enough for the interviewer and the unseen audience beyond the cameras to lean in closer, "the most powerful person in the room is the one who refuses to scream." Her lips curved into a wry, almost conspiratorial smile as she added, "And sometimes, the quietest mic drop is the loudest." A gentle wave of laughter rolled through the small crew gathered behind the cameras, the kind of laughter laced with relief and deep admiration. Even the interviewer cracked a grin, shaking her head as though marveling at how Michelle could turn a political firestorm into a moment of calm clarity. For viewers at home, it was impossible not to smile back, because there was something disarmingly human about Michelle's ability to transform chaos into wisdom, and to do it with humor that cut straight to the truth without ever raising her voice. Across living rooms, people chuckled softly, murmuring to spouses or friends, "That's Michelle for you." And yet, beneath the humor, there was an unmistakable glint of steel in her eyes, the quiet promise that she would keep fighting, keep questioning, and keep speaking for those who felt voiceless. But as the laughter faded, the true weight of what had happened settled in like dusk falling over the city. Because Michelle Obama had reminded America, and perhaps the world, that even its highest judges are just people in robes, fallible, emotional, sometimes driven by pride or fear, and not immune to the same human weaknesses they are meant to rise above. She showed that the law, for all its grand language and tradition, is shaped by the people who interpret it, and that it takes courage to hold those people accountable, no matter how exalted their titles or how imposing their courtrooms. The narrator's voice grew solemn, almost reverent, weaving words like a tapestry as images flickered across the screen in a closing montage. Michelle, her back straight and shoulders squared, walking out of Congress through a tunnel of flashing cameras, her face calm and resolute. Chief Justice John Roberts, sitting behind the long wooden bench, staring down at the table as though the weight of his own words was finally pressing on him with full force. Young activists registering voters on college campuses, bright-eyed and determined, scribbling names into ledgers while holding up signs that read, "Challenge Power," and "Your Voice Matters." The narrator intoned, "Because if you dare challenge power with truth and grace, you might just change the course of history." And as the music swelled, viewers felt a chill rush over their skin, not of fear, but of possibility, of a nation reminded that even in its most hallowed halls, democracy lives and dies by those brave enough to speak when silence would be easier. It was the beginning of a new era of accountability, and though the path ahead seemed daunting and fraught with conflict, one truth blazed like a beacon in the dark. Sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that echoes the longest. As the final images faded and the music softened into a single, lingering note, the narrator's voice returned, gentler now, as though speaking not just to a crowd, but directly to each viewer leaning forward in their chair, still wrapped in the aftershock of everything they had just witnessed. The words came slowly, deliberately, echoing like footsteps in an empty chamber, carrying the weight of both challenge and invitation. So, the narrator began, leaving a moment of silence for the question to build itself in the hush. After watching the Chief Justice scream and a black woman stand unshaken, who do you think truly holds the power in America? And are we brave enough to keep asking the hard questions? It was the kind of question that didn't simply end a story, but opened a door, leaving viewers sitting in the glow of their screens, their hearts still pounding, their minds racing through every detail they'd just seen. In homes across the country, older couples exchanged glances over coffee tables. Grown children called parents to talk about the hearing that had become bigger than any single courtroom. Some stared at the floor, recalling moments when they'd stayed silent in rooms where they should have spoken up. Others felt something new stir inside them, a flicker of resolve, a quiet promise that they would never again let a title or a robe silence the truth. Because in the end, this was about more than a single hearing or a single outburst. It was about the invisible lines of power drawn across America, about who is allowed to question authority and who is told to sit down and be grateful. It was about the courage it takes to ask questions that make the powerful uncomfortable, and the hope that answering those questions might bend the arc of history just a little closer toward justice. The screen held on one final image: Michelle Obama, caught mid-step as she exited the hearing room, her chin lifted, eyes focused straight ahead, moving through a blinding wall of camera flashes with the serene determination of a woman who knew that sometimes the quietest voice in the room was also the most unstoppable. And as the lights faded to black, the narrator whispered the last words, low and urgent. The fight is far from over. The only question left is, who will have the courage to keep asking why? The characters Michelle Obama and Chief Justice John Roberts, as portrayed in this story, are fictional and do not represent real people in real life. This narrative is a work of creative storytelling and dramatization, created purely for entertainment and commentary purposes. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful tales that dive into justice, courage, and the human spirit, don't forget to hit subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me keep bringing you more dramatic, thought-provoking stories every week.